Hi there, this is Erica Merrill, and I'm the founder of Perfect Legal Video. And I'm very excited to talk about a very exciting topic this week with attorney Brian Jones, criminal attorney, and we are going to be talking about OVIs and if they are related to drugs and medication, what happens. And I want to welcome you today, and I can't wait to talk about this topic. It's super interesting. How are you, Brian?
I'm well, Erica. How are you? Thanks for having me on today.
You are welcome. Well, let's jump right into this topic because we hear so much about alcohol arrests, driving under the influence of alcohol, but certainly people don't really think about the drug and medication aspect of getting pulled over, because certainly anything that affects your driving is might cause you to get pulled over.
That's correct. When we talk about DUIs, we almost always talk about DUIs via alcohol. The reality is arrests for DUID or DUI drug cases is on the rise, and officers make it a point when they're investigating their DUI investigations to ask drivers, are you on any prescription medication? Are you taking any drugs? And most people, when confronted with a police officer, they just tell them, and they say, yeah, I'm taking prescription A, B, and C. And the problem with that is that they don't think that they're providing incriminating information, but they are. The officers hear that you're on any prescription medication, and they automatically assume that that prescription medication is going to impair your ability to drive. And they've basically made an arrest decision at that point.
Oh my gosh. Now, okay, so they say any medication, even though not all medications actually make you drowsy or loopy or whatever the side effect could be. It's kind of made that judgment in their mind that they are going to be asking you to step out of the car.
Well, perform field sobriety tests and even just arrest you at that point. What the officers know is that the field sobriety tests are not standardized and not particularized for drug impairment. Now, they have drug recognition evaluators, and that's going to be a whole other topic for another day. These people come in and do a separate, almost medical evaluation of the individual, and they determine whether the person is impaired by any sort of drugs. But we've had cases here in our office where clients were taking cholesterol medication, antihistamines, any sort of allergy medication. And the officer says, well, that can affect your cognitive abilities, or that can affect your blood pressure, that affects your blood flow, and your blood flow affects your reaction time. And they just extrapolate over and over again until they get to the point where they say, yeah, that must have impaired your ability to drive. Because people don't just speed for no reason, right, Erica?
Wow. I mean, certainly a good song comes on the radio and I gotta look down and oh my God, all of a sudden you're going 80 and you didn't even realize it. But yeah, no, that's incredible, because I mean, there's certainly certain medications that it says right on there, don't operate a motor vehicle or heavy equipment, and they give you a list of things that you are able to do and are not able to do when on that medication, but the muscle relaxers and that sort of thing. But wow, I didn't realize that they look at Benadryl and they look at that as something that could impair your driving.
Absolutely. And, obviously, if your medication says don't drive or operate heavy machinery while on this medication, you absolutely should follow that medical advice. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people don't recognize or don't realize that other drugs can be enhanced, or they can enhance the effects of alcohol. And so then the officer says, well, you've had one beer, but you've also taken your blood thinners, and therefore your your brain's impairment from that one drink is higher than what a normal person's brain would be on one drink. And so they extrapolate and they make this determination that the combination of one beer and, having taken your Lipitor 8 hours before has obviously impaired you too much to be a safe driver.
Wow, that's unbelievable. So one of my questions to you was going to be about, how do they know the difference between whether it's alcohol, it's drugs, or medication? And then, of course, there's the complication of having a combination like that. And so it sounds to me like what you're saying is any drug and then any mixture, they just automatically arrest you.
They're more likely to make an arrest decision under those circumstances. Absolutely.
Now, you said that these are on the rise. I mean, it sounds like they're becoming more aware of medication. And obviously, marijuana has been one of the drugs that is becoming more and more popular over the years, it seems. It's legalized in a lot of states now, and there are stores and vaping and everything popping up on every corner, just like CVS in certain states where it's been legalized for a little bit. And so, I mean, I guess, like, what do they do when they pull you over and they think that they smell marijuana? And, like, is there any difference to how they treat that as opposed to an arrest that has to do with your alcohol sobriety?
Erica, in my experience, when an officer suspects a driver of using marijuana or being impaired by marijuana while they're driving, they don't conduct their investigation any differently than they would with a driver they suspect of being impaired by alcohol. They're still going to have you exit the car. They're going to interrogate you without the benefit of your Miranda warnings. They're going to encourage you and coerce you to perform field sobriety tests, and then make their arrest decision based on all of those circumstances. The place where it changes significantly is after that arrest decision, because after that arrest decision is made, the officer gets the choice of a blood, breath, or urine test. And in the case where they suspect the driver to be impaired by a drug in addition to alcohol or a drug exclusively, they always choose the blood or urine test.
I see. So they have a choice of the three. Do they ever use more than one?
I have had cases where the officer has been, let's say, unsatisfied with the results of a breath test and then said, well, I want a urine test as well. It's a contested issue as to whether that is a legitimate additional request under the administrative license codes. But as far as the evidentiary value of it, if you submit that urine test at that point, that evidence can absolutely be used against you. And the problem is that, especially with urine tests and even with blood tests to some extent, that's a historic look at the contents of your body. And there's really no way to timestamp the contents of your blood or urine to a particular moment in time. The moment in time that matters for law enforcement is the moment where you're actually driving. Marijuana is particularly bad for this because the metabolite that marijuana THC breaks down into in your body is a fat soluble metabolite. So it stays in your body longer than alcohol, longer than really any other drug. In some cases, 30, 60, or even 90 days later. So somebody that's a habitual marijuana user and gets pulled over, even though they haven't smoked marijuana that day, could test positive for marijuana, even though they're totally sober at the time of arrest. Somebody that's not a habitual marijuana user that used marijuana within the last week may test positive for that THC metabolite, even though there's no active THC in their body.
And I've heard that, and I've heard that I don't know if this is still true, but they have tests on your hair for those types of drugs. Is that right?
There is a process for a hair follicle test. That is an even more historic record. They don't use those for DUI enforcement that I've ever experienced.
Oh, okay. I mean, that's because those last forever. That's why you hear the crazy stories about like Britney Spears shaving her head, right? When she was
Right.
in custody battle and that sort of thing.
Correct.
Yeah. So it can get pretty interesting. So, I mean, in your opinion, would the roadside tests really be as effective for medication and marijuana? And I don't know if those are just two separate, if you want to say something different about marijuana than you do about medication. But is it different, do you think, than the alcohol?
I think it is. The roadside field sobriety tests were validated in very specific circumstances. And they were validated when those tests are performed according to the standards and protocols that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration set forth. And they're only validated for alcohol. So in my opinion, they have no validity when it comes to drugs or marijuana. Now, the reality of those tests is that they are tests of your intellectual and coordination abilities, your dexterity, both gross and fine motor skills. Testing so many things at once is scientifically difficult at best and hazardous at worst, because you don't know which aspect of the individual is resulting in the so-called clues that the officers look for when administering these tests. The real problem with drugs and marijuana is that there's really no evidence that those motor skills are impaired. There's just not been that study. I think we can all agree that if somebody has taken an excessive amount of opioids, their motor skills are going to be impaired. But the problem with making that assumption in court is that it's just that, an assumption. And there are specific rules that say you're not allowed to assume things in court. You're not allowed to speculate as to what might be. And if we're relying on science, we should be relying on accurate science.
Yeah, now absolutely. Science is a big deal when it comes to these tests, and like you said, they designed all these to handle driving under the influence of alcohol, and now they have to go back to the drawing board and find something that's going to work for medication. And honestly, there's so many types of medication, you'd almost have to have something different for each one, figure out what you're dealing with. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with that. That's just a layman's opinion.
I think it would be really difficult for the officers and for the National Highway Traffic Administration to develop tests particularized to all kinds of drugs out there. We're talking about thousands of different drugs. Even if we were to narrow it down to various classes of drugs, stimulants, depressants, opioids, et cetera, I think they would have a hard time developing a test that was accurate to those areas. The more accurate look is, the most accurate look, unfortunately, is the blood test. And then having a physician or a toxicologist extrapolate from that data whether the person was being affected by the drugs at that point. Unfortunately, law enforcement isn't willing to invest in those physicians, and prosecutors aren't willing to invest in those physicians to make sure that we're accurately prosecuting people who are dangerous on the roads.
Yeah, and I mean, and the reason I brought that up is because obviously they're not going to be able to tell what the heck's going on, like just in a minute, like which drug these people are on. They're lying about it most of the time. But we were talking about motions to suppress last week, and I just wondered, with everything we talked about last week, and we were mostly talking about alcohol-related arrests, but I mean, what are the most common things that you can suppress in a case that has to do with marijuana and drug use?
Anytime the field sobriety tests are conducted, there's fertile ground for challenging the application, the instruction, and the grading of those tests. So if a person is ordered to and does perform field sobriety tests, that's an area of the stop that we're going to focus on and ensure that those tests were conducted properly. And if they weren't conducted properly, we're going to raise that issue with the court and ask the court to exclude that test. With the drug impairment cases, as I said, we're usually looking at a urine test. Occasionally, we're looking at a blood test. That is also fertile ground. Under Ohio law, the Ohio Administrative Code sets forth very specific standards for how the sample is to be collected, how the sample is to be handled between collection and the testing facility, and how the testing facility is supposed to perform the tests on that sample. So as an example, if you have a blood draw and that blood is sent off and the lab puts it on the counter instead of putting it in the refrigerator, that if that blood has any alcohol in it, that alcohol is going to continue to ferment and the alcohol content of that blood sample is going to increase. Blood has sugars in it, alcohol ferments with sugars, and so you've got now basically a little wine cask sitting on the desk at the forensic laboratory. Those rules apply equally to drug samples as well. So the protocols have to be followed, and if they're not followed, those test results can be excluded from evidence. Another classic example is the testing machine itself. These machines obviously are not testing the entirety of the blood in a human body. They're taking a sample, that sample is being sent off to the lab, but even of that sample, only a tiny, tiny fraction is used for the actual test. So the machines that do these tests basically take the result that they find and then multiply it by thousands and thousands of times over. If there's even the tiniest miscalculation in that test, that miscalculation is then multiplied thousands and thousands of times over to report the ultimate result. So even the tiniest little errors can result in wildly misrepresented result reports.
Wow, that is really interesting. I hadn't even thought about like what happens to the test samples if you leave them out. I mean, you think about, you buy a jug of milk, you know, sometimes it sours early. I know I come up with these, but seriously though, I mean, if it's in the summer, they might have the milk sitting out for a while, and it speeds up the fermentation process or the souring of it, and you know, voila, a week before the date that it's supposed to last until, it's completely disgusting and clumped up.
That sounds terrible.
Well, I don't drink milk, but I remember that happening when I did.
Yeah, I have when I was in college, Erica, there were definitely some science projects unintended occurring in my refrigerator. So I've that too.
So, I mean, so how do you know, I guess is my question, because if that happens to my milk, and my daughter drinks it sometimes, I always, you know, smell it first and make sure it's okay. But I mean, like, how do you know that happens? I mean, you obviously know if something looks wildly inaccurate because it's out of range of what anybody's blood level could be. But like, are there other ways that you can tell if a test is inaccurate for, you know, drugs and marijuana and even alcohol testing?
Absolutely. So one of the things that my firm does in all forensic testing cases is we subpoena what's called the bench notes of the laboratory. And those bench notes include an evidence log that tracks where the sample is at all times. So from the moment it arrives at the lab to the moment that it is put back in the laboratory storage following the test, that sample should be tracked. And if there are any gaps in that evidence log, we're going to focus in on that and try and figure out what happened in those moments. The bench notes will also show us what machine the test was conducted on, the particular analyst who conducted the test, the analyst that reviewed the results, And then we can go back and look at both the machines, maintenance records and calibration history, and the history of that particular analyst to see if they're doing things properly. And those are the easy ways that we can identify errors in the testing process. If we get more into the mathematical errors or the actual chemistry of the testing process, we're going to want to look to an expert witness, somebody that has experience working with these machines, and they can look deeper into both the mechanics of the machine itself, the credentials of the person who ran the tests, the analyst, and if necessary, run a second test on the sample. So Ohio law provides that anybody that's accused of OVI is permitted to, at their own expense, have a second test of that sample run. And then additional tests can be run on that sample to see if something has spoiled the sample.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a whole side of it that you have to pay attention to make sure that your clients are getting fair results, and that it's not something that maybe you should have suppressed.
Absolutely. Yeah. The problem is that it gets expensive. This second test can cost up to $1,000. Expert witnesses to review and analyze these reports cost thousands of dollars. And you wonder what level of justice those who aren't of substantial means can get.
No, that's a really good thought. Yeah, that sounds like some people might get well, I don't want to say might not get treated fairly. Let's just
might
say.
Not find justice.
So thinking, I don't know if you've thought about this. I know you have thought about this. Half of the states are legalizing marijuana, and your state has not legalized marijuana yet. How close do you think you are to getting that legalized, and what kind of effects do you think that is going to have on past cases? Do you think some people will be retrying cases? And it just seems like it's going to be a circus once that happens. I know it kind of was here, because they have no way of testing if somebody is actually under the influence of marijuana. No great scientific way anyway.
Erica, that's a great question, and it leads to 2 points. First, Ohio has medicinal marijuana, and Michigan, our very close and thoroughly despised neighbor, has legalized recreational marijuana. So a person that lives, say, in Toledo can drive literally 5 or 10 minutes away, purchase and use recreational marijuana, sleep overnight in Michigan, not drive until they're completely unaffected by the marijuana the next day, and get pulled over for literally any reason whatsoever, improper sticker on their license plate. And if an officer requests a chemical test, and that test is going to come back positive for marijuana, even though they used it in a state where it's legal, and it's not affecting them at the time of their driving. So with the legalization of medical marijuana in Ohio, there are thousands of drivers that are validly using their marijuana for medicinal purposes, who at any time can get pulled over, even though they're not currently affected by that. They can get charged with a DUI. The other point that I think is even more widely concerning are individuals who are taking their prescription drugs as prescribed, and they don't have those warning labels on their prescription bottles. Right. Their bottle does not say anything about avoiding driving. Their bottle does not say anything about mixing alcohol with their prescription. Those individuals are also at risk, because even if you are taking your medication as prescribed, an officer can still accuse you of driving while impaired. And if you don't have an attorney that understands how to convey that information to a jury or a judge, or hopefully a reasonable prosecutor, you can ultimately be convicted of driving while impaired or driving while intoxicated, just for simply taking your medication as your physician prescribed it.
Wow, that doesn't seem fair.
It doesn't, does it?
No. And I guess if somebody has these issues, they get pulled over.
So popular.
You are popular. That's somebody that has a question that we're answering right now, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Now, so if somebody gets pulled over, last week you revealed to us something very important that anyone that I tell this piece of information, they've all said, "Really? I can call an attorney before I decide to blow into a breathalyzer or take a field sobriety test? Really?" And I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely. You're allowed to do that." I mean, they're too stressed out and nervous at the time to think to even ask, most likely. But I mean, that is the case. Now, if someone were to call you on, and they had taken, they revealed to you that they were on some medications, maybe they mixed it with alcohol, or maybe it was, that they had been smoking marijuana. What are the tips that you would give them as far as like taking the field test and the breathalyzer and what to do next?
Erica, my advice is always no talk, no blow, and no walk. No walk, no talk, no blow. Because of the unreliability of the field sobriety test, because of the unreliability of the breath test, and that applies to the urine and blood screens as well. Now, obviously, there are some individuals out there who have prior convictions, and refusing to submit to a chemical test could be an offense in and of itself. And those individuals should absolutely comply with the law. But for individuals who don't have those precursors, the dangers of an erroneous test far outweigh the consequences of a license suspension that can be fought in court, because that erroneous evidence will be heavily relied on by prosecutors and judges.
That's that's about what you said last week too, and I guess that goes for alcohol, drugs, or marijuana. That advice remains. Do not
Absolutely.
talk, blow, or walk, as you said, take the field sobriety test, and make sure that you stay on point with that. There was one thing I forgot to ask. I wanted to back up and just ask you, is there a big difference in your opinion between the smoking marijuana and the edibles when you're pulled over?
There really isn't. Your body is going to be affected in the same way, albeit over different periods of time. The reality of actual impairment by marijuana is that it generally lasts somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 hours. Now, edibles are going to be on the higher end of that and can be extended a little bit further than that. But beyond that level of actual impairment of your intellectual and motor skills, it doesn't last. However, the metabolite, the way that your body processes it, it is going to last for certainly days, and probably weeks.
Okay, I mean, so that's interesting. So these tests, the ones for drugs, are really, you'd be unsure to know if it's something that was in your system from 2 hours ago or from 2 days ago. And that can cause huge problems when you're getting pulled over and arrested and they're starting to test you for drugs.
Exactly.
Wow, you have your work cut out for you.
The DUI drug cases, like I said earlier, they're very much on the rise. And I think there's 3 factors contributing to that. You've hit the nail on the head with one of them, in that marijuana in America has become much more widely used, with legalization, both recreational and medical marijuana being passed in a lot of states. I think there's a majority of states now. The other factors are honestly a decrease in people committing the offense of DUI by alcohol. With the advent of Uber and Lyft, more people are catching rides, and people are becoming more aware of the dangers of driving intoxicated and just doing it less. So their catches are going down, and so the enforcement and inaccurate enforcement of DUI by drug is increasing. The third factor that Ohio has been unfortunately hit by more significantly than a lot of states is the opioid crisis. And when those three things all came together at almost the exact same time, it created a spike in DUI drug enforcement.
Wow. I hadn't thought of that. So you guys have experienced all three at the same time.
Yes. Yeah. Ohio passed recreational marijuana about 2 years ago. It went into effect last year. So people have not had their medical marijuana cards for even a year at this point. Ohio was one of the hardest hit states with the opioid crisis. And then just nationwide, DUI by alcohol is being reduced.
Okay. So you were saying that Michigan, which is right next door, has legalized the use of recreational. When did that happen?
Ooh, I'd have to Google it, but
Oh,
yeah, it's been
but I'm sure
recreational.
you're affected somewhat by it.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I'm sure your cases are affected by it because, as you said, they can just drive across the line and get it if they want to, and then come right back over.
We're about 2.5 hours, 2 hours from the border. So we don't get a lot of those cases. What we do get are people who live in Michigan and are just passing through. And you know, they're as subject to the Ohio laws as anybody who is a citizen of the state of Ohio. So I frequently get people, and Michigan had medical marijuana long before Ohio did. We would frequently get people that said, but I have my medical card. Why, how can they prosecute me for this? And the answer was always, well, they can prosecute you this because A, it doesn't matter if you're validly prescribed these medications. And B, if they were caught in possession of even medical marijuana, it was still illegal in Ohio at that time. So they could be prosecuted for it because they're not in Michigan anymore.
Oh, okay. So you have to be careful when you're traveling through from Michigan into Ohio.
Absolutely.
So what is your advice? Like, how can an attorney help you in these types of cases? What's the best strategy?
Well, these are some of the most complicated cases that any attorney is going to handle. Too often I hear attorneys say, well, I can handle a DUI, that's easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. The science is extensive. And an attorney that is trained in the science of DUI drugs is really a few and far between occurrence. So the first thing that anybody out there needs to do is make sure that their attorney understands the science to the degree any attorney should. Make sure that they understand that, especially in a marijuana case, the results of that chemical test does not indicate marijuana's in the blood. There's no such thing. We don't inject marijuana buds directly into our bloodstream. It's THC that causes that lightheaded, fuzzy, euphoric feeling. But the result of those tests is the metabolite. It's an inactive ingredient that your body turns the THC, the active THC, into in order to expel it from the body. So your attorney should have that basic information. Your attorney should be able to talk to you about the effects that any medication that you are on would have on you, should understand where to go and find that information. And your attorney should then take all of that knowledge and explain it to the prosecutor. If the prosecutor isn't willing to be reasonable and treat you fairly, then your attorney will move to exclude that evidence, both based on scientific grounds and on legal grounds. And if the judge doesn't agree and the judge doesn't want to follow the law and understand the science, then your attorney needs to be ready, willing, and able to explain all of that information to a jury. And that's where an attorney becomes honestly the most helpful. I find myself more and more frequently telling clients these days, the only justice that you will receive is the justice that you demand. And you demand that justice from your peers, from, in the case of a DUI, 8 citizens of the county that's accusing you. And those citizens are reasonable. Those citizens are people like you and me, Erica. They understand this science to the level that they need to the level that they need so that they can understand that, a person that smoked marijuana 3 days ago isn't high today. So that's how the attorney helps you.
I think that's great, because so often you don't demand that kind of help, and you don't demand that test results get retaken if they seem like they're off. I mean, I think this is all really great information that not a lot of people have. And so, yeah, I definitely want to thank you for your information today on these arrests that have to do with drugs and marijuana. Before we go, I do just want to give everyone a sneak peek into next month. You alternate your months on topics. And so one month we'll be talking about, more things with OVIs and, all the topics we've been talking about this month that are around those types of cases. But you also handle a lot of sex cases. And I know that you are really the kind of person that is big-hearted, trying to help out and do things that are fair for your clients. And not everything is black and white. And, really focusing on rehabilitation for these sex crimes where, really once they happen, once you admit you have a problem, in that case, you get arrested, and then there is no help. So I'm going to let you take it away and talk a little bit about what you're doing with an expert that you're partnering with next month. And, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So next month is February. Obviously, love is in the air. So we make it one of the months that we talk about sexual assault and sex crimes defense. We have represented a number of clients over the past few years who have admitted sexual addictions, sexual paraphilias, and the reality of their situation is that had they gotten the help that they needed, they very well may never have committed the crimes that they were ultimately convicted of. And so we want to set forth and we want to create an initiative to help people get the treatment that they need. And in my experience, there's really 3 kinds of people who get caught up with sexual assault and sex crime allegations. The first one is people who are the victim of false allegations. And that's a significantly larger population than I think anybody's willing to admit. The second group are people that have made a terrible mistake. They regret it, and they need a lot of education on consent and why what their behavior did was inappropriate and wrong. And there's consequences for that. And those people absolutely need to suffer that consequence, but they also need the redirection to make sure that they don't do it again. The third category of people are what we're going to talk about in at least one of our sessions next month, which are people that have diagnosable paraphilias. And the reality of their situation is that if they want to get treatment, if they go to a counselor or a psychologist, that counselor can very well feel obligated to turn that information over to law enforcement. And the situation that the client then is trying to avoid in the first place now comes crashing down around them. So what we're doing is we're starting a program where people with those paraphilias, with those diagnosable mental health issues, can get some legal advice and pair that legal advice with a treatment provider to get them the help they need to make sure that nobody's hurt as the result of their mental illness. We think about people that are addicted to drugs, people that are addicted to heroin, people that are addicted to opiates. And they walk into a treatment facility and they say, I'm an addict, I need help. And that treatment facility doesn't immediately turn them over to the police. but people that have a paraphilia, be it exhibitionism or voyeurism or even pedophilia, go into a treatment provider and disclose that information. And next thing they know, there's a law enforcement officer at their house trying to take them into custody. And so they fear that, and they never get the treatment that they need, the treatment that could prevent them from committing a crime that harms a person or harms a child. And we want to do everything we can to make sure that, no children are harmed, to prevent future crimes. So that's the reason we're starting this initiative. And at least one of our sessions here in February is going to be about that.
Well, I'm really looking forward to that information next month. And I think that it's going to be very interesting and thought-provoking for our audience. And, perhaps people, may agree or disagree. But whether you agree or disagree, the problem is out there. And really what we're focusing on is working on helping people get better so that more people don't get hurt.
That's absolutely right, Erica. We can address this problem head on as a society together, or we can drive these people into the shadows where they're never going to get treatment and eventually they're going to harm someone. So I would prefer to bring it out in the open, discuss it, and get these people treatment that they need, rather than drive them into the shadows and risk, some child being harmed.
Well, that's fantastic. And I'm looking forward to having those discussions with you. And, it's tough topics, but like you said, it's better to face it head on. So I'll look forward to talking about that in a couple of weeks. I think our first one is going to be on Valentine's Day. So that ought to be.
Boy, love is in the air.
That's right. When you take love too far. But we'll definitely get these topics tackled. And I hope everybody tunes in, and I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you so much for spending so much time at the end of a day on a Friday. I hope you go out and have some fun this weekend.
Thanks, Erica. It was good to spend the time with you. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.